I sat in stunned silence, the $4.99 plastic clock still ticking in my lap, as laughter echoed down the hallway. My son's wife toasted her mother's wrist, a diamond-studded Cartier, catching every chandelier light like it belonged there. "We thought something simple for your laundry room," he'd said, smiling. After raising him alone, after funding his college, after decades of silence-swallowed sacrifices, he gave me a clearance tag and called it thoughtful. That was the moment I stopped being sentimental and started being strategic. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret Doyle held the gift bag lightly, like it might bite her. Her eyes stayed on the pale blue tissue poking from the top, but her fingertips already knew the texture beneath: light, hollow, plastic, cheap. She'd seen it on the clearance shelf at Dollar Time just last Tuesday, crammed between plastic wind chimes and chipped soap dispensers. Clearance, $4.99 in red Sharpie. She hadn't given it a second glance then. She couldn't take her eyes off it now. 3 feet away, Lois Hartley fluttered her hand like royalty receiving tribute. A diamond-studded Cartier watch glinted beneath the chandeliers of La Rosetta, Raleigh's most upscale brunch spot. The sparkle caught the light and the attention of everyone nearby. "Oh, Brian, you shouldn't have." Lois cooed, her voice pitched perfectly for the room to hear. Her laugh was syrupy and smug. The table next to them actually clapped. Brian grinned, puffed up with pride like a rooster in a suit. "You deserve the best," he said. Cheryl, his wife, leaned into the spotlight with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We saw it at the boutique last week and said, 'That's Mom.'" Margaret blinked. "Mom." Then Cheryl turned to her with a cheerful little wink and nudged the bag toward her across the linen-covered table. "And something practical for your wall," she said. Margaret's pulse stuttered. She pulled the clock out gently, the kind of motion that could only come from someone trained for decades to maintain composure. Former principal hands, steady and unreadable. The clock was round, white, plastic, with a twitchy red second hand and numbers printed so large it bordered on insulting. It ticked audibly, the sound slicing through the soft jazz humming above their heads. Brian chuckled without looking at her. "Figured you might need one in the laundry room or something." The words floated above the table, light as air and heavy as a stone. "Oh, isn't that cute?" Lois said, not even pretending to hide the laugh that followed. Margaret smiled, a tight, polite smile. It held. She set the clock next to her untouched mimosa. The plastic casing made a hollow knock against the china plate. The clink of silverware and the swirl of mimosa glasses seemed to amplify around her. The velvet chair she sat in suddenly felt cold through her slacks. Someone 2 tables over asked for extra lemon. A child dropped a spoon. Cheryl snapped a selfie with Lois and the watch, their grins sparkling. "Put it on Insta," she whispered. Margaret's gaze lingered on the face of the clock. The time read 11:58. 2 minutes left in brunch. 2 minutes too long. Lois leaned back and rested her Cartier against her wine glass, turning her wrist to admire the reflection. "A woman's timepiece says everything about her," she said with a flourish. Margaret nodded slightly. "That it does." The waiter returned with the check, tucked in a leather folio. Cheryl plucked it up and waved it. "Taken care of." "Brian insisted," she announced, loud enough for the next table to hear. As they stood to leave, Brian gave his mother a half hug, a quick pat and more. Margaret shifted, brushing her purse along the table's edge. The gift bag tipped slightly, and something fluttered to the floor. She bent slowly, knees creaking from years of ignored arthritis, and picked up the small square of thermal paper. It was a receipt. Dollar Time, $4.99, dated last Tuesday at 2:43 p.m. There was no note, no card, just that. Her fingers folded the receipt once, then again, her hands steady, despite the hot flush spreading up her neck. She slipped it into her purse, not knowing why exactly, only that it felt heavier than it should have. Heavier even than the clock. Outside, the spring breeze was thick with magnolia and distant traffic. Brian opened the SUV for Lois, with a little bow. Cheryl adjusted her sunglasses and blew a kiss toward her mother. Margaret said nothing. She walked to the curb in silence, the hard edge of the receipt digging into her palm as her fingers clenched her purse tight. It wasn't the clock that hurt. It was what it measured, how little they thought of her. The clock sat in the center of Margaret's kitchen table like a plastic insult. Its second hand ticked with the persistence of something that didn't understand. It wasn't wanted. She hadn't unwrapped it fully. The bubble wrap still clung to the edges, like it was trying to protect something fragile, but there was nothing in it worth saving. She picked it up gently, almost reverently, and placed it back into the thin gift bag. The crinkle of the tissue paper sounded louder in the silence of her home than it had in the restaurant. Her fingers moved methodically, smoothing the edges, folding the handles, then, purse in hand, she left without a coat. Dollar time was 5 minutes away. The cashier didn't blink when she handed it over. He scanned the receipt, handed her $4.99 in cash, and tossed the clock onto a bin behind the counter already half filled with returned junk, fake plants, mismatched mugs, broken toys. Margaret stared at the bills in her hand, then folded them carefully into her wallet. No words, no drama, no raised voice, just a quiet reversal. But something inside her had already begun to burn. By the time she got home, Evelyn Chase was already letting herself in through the side door like she had done for decades. She carried a paper bag full of lemon muffins, and a knowing look that cut sharper than any greeting. "You didn't answer my text," Evelyn said, eyeing her. "You always answer my text." Margaret slid her purse onto the hook by the fridge, avoiding eye contact. "I was out. In Sensible Flats. No lipstick. You only run errands like that when something's wrong." Evelyn narrowed her eyes. "Tell me." Margaret hesitated, her back to her friend, but the words finally tumbled out. "Flat. Measured but heavy. He gave Lois a diamond Cartier. And he gave me a wall clock. From Dollar Time. $4.99. Evelyn blinked. "What?" "I returned it. Just now." She opened her wallet and set the bills down on the kitchen counter like exhibit evidence. Silence filled the space between them. Outside, a lawnmower hummed faintly. Somewhere a dog barked. In here, Evelyn's breath grew tight. "He gave that woman a luxury watch, and gave you something he wouldn't even hang in his garage?" Evelyn's voice sharpened. Margaret gave the slightest nod. Evelyn didn't sit. She walked in a slow, tight circle, like she was trying to contain fury inside her body. Then she stopped. "He treated you like clearance. Make him pay full price." Margaret looked up at her. There was no tears in her eyes, just calculation. "You remember when we updated my estate plan last year?" "Of course, I filed the copies myself," Evelyn said. "You left everything to Brian." Margaret crossed the kitchen and pulled out the drawer beneath the toaster. Tucked beneath old utility bills and 2 expired coupons was a slim blue folder. She laid it flat on the table, opened it, and began to flip. Pages rustled like dry leaves as Evelyn leaned over her shoulder. There it was, her signature, his name, Margaret's assets, her home, her savings, everything neatly spelled out. Sole heir, Brian Doyle. "Then it's his time I'll erase," she said quietly. Evelyn's mouth twitched into something between a smile and a snarl. She pulled out her phone, tapped rapidly, then handed Margaret a contact card on the screen. "Thomas Reed," she said. "A state lawyer. Precise, quiet, cold when he needs to be." Margaret studied the name. "Is he good?" Evelyn didn't flinch. "He doesn't miss." Margaret didn't touch the phone. Not yet. But the seed was planted. The kind of seed that didn't grow into flowers, but something with thorns. The returned $4.99 still sat on the counter behind them, forgotten. But in Margaret's eyes, a different kind of clock had just started ticking. The law office smelled like cedar and cold coffee. Margaret stepped through the glass doors, carrying a manila folder like it was a weapon. She hadn't dressed to impress, gray slacks, soft sweater, no jewelry. But her eyes were sharp, and her grip didn't waver. As she walked past the waiting area filled with slick realtors, and quiet young couples, clutching property documents. Evelyn sat on a bench near the window, legs crossed, calm as ever. "He's ready," she said without standing. "Wants to see the woman behind the firestorm." Margaret didn't smile. She didn't need to. Thomas Reed's office was clean shelves, black and white diplomas, a single potted plant that looked real but probably wasn't. He didn't get up from behind his desk when they entered, just motioned with 2 fingers to the seats across from him and said, "Mrs. Doyle, Miss Chase." His voice was dry as dust but crisp, like a man used to being obeyed without needing volume. Margaret sat. She placed the folder on the desk and opened it with deliberate slowness. "These are the documents I signed last year. My estate plan. It names my son Brian Doyle as sole beneficiary." Thomas pulled the papers forward, eyes already scanning. He didn't speak for nearly a minute, but the rustle of the pages and the ticking wall clock behind him filled the silence. "I assume this is no longer satisfactory," he said finally, flipping to the final page. Margaret sat straighter. "No. After what he did, it's not just about changing the will, it's about making sure he never profits from me again." Thomas looked up, studying her for the first time. "Walk me through it." She did. From the clink of the Cartier box to the twitchy red hand of the $4.99 wall clock. Every insult, every smirk, every petty dismissal, all served without raising her voice. When she finished, Thomas leaned back, fingertips steepled under his chin. "So you came to me because you want to rewrite your will." "I came because I want him out of it. Entirely." He nodded once. "You want him cut?" She stared back. "I want him crushed." Evelyn gave a soft, satisfied hum. "Tick-tock, counselor." Thomas didn't blink. He turned back to his screen, tapping his keyboard with fast, practiced precision. "Before we proceed, I'll need to check a few things." "What kind of things?" Margaret asked. "Liabilities, dependencies, outstanding liens." He paused. "Your son has a financial relationship with you, whether or not you approved it." He clicked, scrolled, clicked again. The silence grew. Outside, someone slammed a car door. The ticking clock grew louder. Then Thomas stilled. "That's interesting," he said slowly. Evelyn leaned forward. "Define interesting." He swiveled the monitor toward them. "Brian Doyle took out a line of credit 8 months ago, secured partially against your name." Margaret blinked. "What? 200,000. Approved with your retirement accounts listed as future collateral. It's sophisticated fraud, really. If you didn't co-sign it, that's a felony." "He used my name." Margaret's voice was calm, but her fists clenched in her lap, knuckles whitening. "Yes. Digital authorization forged. He probably assumed no one would check until you were gone." Evelyn's lips parted, her eyes narrowing. "He stole her future and tried to time it with her death." Margaret's breath came shorter now, not in panic, but in realization. "He didn't just humiliate me, he robbed me." Thomas nodded once. "That's where this shifts. This isn't just about rewriting a will anymore. This is financial abuse." Margaret didn't hesitate. "What happens next?" "I file. He gets audited. If we prove intent, we freeze his accounts. Possibly criminal charges, but it's a process." Evelyn smiled. "Good. Let's begin the countdown." Thomas reached into his drawer and pulled out a thicker file. "Then we'll do this in phases. First, protect your assets. Then make sure he never gets a penny." But he paused mid-sentence, tapping the screen again, eyes narrowing. "There's more here. Transfers I didn't expect. Looks like he borrowed not just against your accounts, but someone else's name too. Someone older." Margaret tilted her head. "Who?" Thomas stared at the file for a moment, then turned the screen again. "Lois Hartley." Evelyn let out a breathy curse under her breath. Margaret didn't smile, but something in her posture shifted, sharpened. The rules had changed. This wasn't just betrayal, it was layered, dangerous. "Looks like your son's clock is already ticking," Thomas said. The cursor blinked in silence on Thomas's screen, but the numbers didn't lie. Margaret sat motionless, eyes fixed on the summary of the loan, $200,000, secured under her name, approved 8 months ago. The lender was local. The documents carried a digital signature, hers, only it wasn't. She leaned forward, the edges of the desk pressing into her forearms. I never signed this. I've never even heard of this bank. Thomas tapped a key and pulled up the authorization file. He forged your signature electronically. Not sophisticated, but just enough to pass initial verification. The fact that you're alive and lucid, that works in our favor. Beside her, Evelyn's fists clenched in her lap. I want his hands broken, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Margaret didn't answer. Her eyes tracked the dates, the transfers, the fine print, line after line of betrayal, camouflaged in finance. He borrowed my future, she whispered, voice thin, without asking. Thomas nodded grimly. This is financial abuse. Elder financial exploitation, to be exact. It's a felony, and he left a paper trail. Then let's not waste time, Evelyn said, standing abruptly. I want to see the look on his face when it all comes crashing in. But Thomas didn't flinch. That's where we have to be careful. He used your name. That doesn't just make him a thief. It makes you on paper liable. For now, Margaret blinked. You mean creditors will think you took the loan, he said. Until we correct the record in court. A heavy silence settled between them. Outside the window, the gray sky hung low over downtown Raleigh, thick and pressing, like a storm trying to decide if it would break. The hum of traffic filtered in through the double-paned glass. Inside, the only sound was the faint click of Evelyn unlocking her phone. She scoffed. Of course she posted it. Margaret turned. Who? Evelyn turned the screen toward her. Cheryl's Instagram feed. There was Lois, reclined in a patio chair outside what looked like a private spa, arm extended for the camera. The Cartier glinted under the sun, obnoxiously captioned, spoiled and sparkling thanks to my favorite couple in the world. #luxury ballure. #queen status. Cheryl had tagged Brian in the photo, and the spa, and the jeweler. Margaret's jaw set hard. Let her brag, Evelyn muttered. It'll bury them faster. Thomas smiled faintly. Actually, it just might. Public display of assets during a pending fraud case. That'll look very compelling to a judge. Margaret reached for her purse and stood slower than usual, but more grounded. Her voice, when it came, was cool and deliberate. He'll learn the cost of time. Thomas turned to his monitor, fingers already gliding across the keyboard. I'm filing today. Financial exploitation of an elder, fraudulent use of identity, and misappropriation of estate funds. Based on the numbers, a hearing will be expedited. How soon? Evelyn asked. Soon enough, he said. The courthouse clock just started ticking. Margaret gave one last look at the screen. Her name, once a symbol of everything she'd built, her decades in education, her savings, her plans had been twisted by the son she raised, but now it was hers again. She walked out of the office without a word, her heels striking against the polished floor like a metronome, not angry, not emotional, just ready. The papers felt heavier than they should have. Thomas had said that was normal. People feel weight when they carry consequences. But as Margaret stood outside the Wake County Courthouse, the crisp manila folder in her hand pressed like steel against her chest, a breeze cut across the plaza, lifting her hair. The late morning sun did little to warm the sting on her face. She took a breath, then another, grounding herself. She'd walked into boardrooms, parent tribunals, and teacher strikes, but never like this. Not as the mother of a man who'd gambled her life away. Inside, the courthouse buzzed, clacking heels, murmuring voices, rubber soles squeaking against polished tile. Evelyn walked beside her, measured and sharp in navy blue. She didn't say much, didn't have to. Her presence was a wall. Thomas met them at the security checkpoint, with his usual calm, offering only a small nod before leading them to the clerk's office. It was done in under 15 minutes. Petition is filed, he confirmed, folding his hands behind his back. We requested emergency relief. Financial exploitation under North Carolina statute. Your case just jumped the line. Margaret didn't smile. When will he find out? Thomas raised a brow. Any moment now. It didn't take long. Brian had just finished a second Bloody Mary when Cheryl barged into the backyard, phone clutched in her hand like a detonator. They froze the American Trust account. She hissed, face pale beneath her spray tan. I tried to order from Lanvin, and my card got declined, twice. Brian blinked. What are you talking about? Your mother filed something. I don't know what. But she went to court with Evelyn, of course. Thomas Reed is representing her. Brian stood, the rattan chair groaning under his sudden movement. Wait, Thomas Reed. That guy? She hired him? Do I look like I'm joking? Cheryl barked. I had to leave my cart full of gift sets in the checkout queue. I was humiliated. Lois, sunbathing beside the pool in a leopard print robe, slid her sunglasses down. Please, Margaret's bluffing. She doesn't have the stomach for legal battles. She's a schoolmarm with a flair for drama. Brian swallowed hard. He knew his mother. Knew when her silence meant more than her shouting. And she hadn't raised her voice. Not once. She can't touch you, Lois added with a dismissive wave. She's just blowing wolf steam. No, came a voice from behind them. It wasn't loud, but it cut. Margaret stood just inside the gate, Evelyn at her shoulder. She hadn't knocked, hadn't called. She didn't have to. I already have, she said simply. Lois sat up, startled. How dare you come here uninvited? Cheryl cut in. You're insane. You think this makes you look powerful? This is pathetic. Margaret turned to Brian. You used my name to open accounts. You forged my authorization. You borrowed against my death. His mouth opened but no sound came. I'm not dying, she continued. Not anytime soon, which means the bill came due while I'm still here to collect it. Evelyn stepped forward and smiled faintly. Tick-tock. Back at the courthouse, Thomas closed his laptop, expression tight. Judge Ramirez signed the motion this afternoon. Immediate freeze on all accounts tied to Brian Doyle, including joint and discretionary. Margaret nodded once, no triumph in her eyes, just cold, clean resolve. What about Cheryl? Evelyn asked, arms crossed. She's not named on the fraud yet, but the moment we find her fingerprints, she'll be in the crosshairs too. Thomas turned the monitor toward them. The judge's signature was still wet. They've lost access to everything. Credit, debit, lines of equity. Until the trial, they're frozen. Margaret stared at the document, letting it sink in, not for revenge, for clarity. Her son had wagered her time like poker chips, and now he'd been dealt silence. Outside the window, the courthouse bell struck once. A dull echo rolled across the city, swallowed by the sound of traffic and distance. It was the first minute of the hour that would change everything. The waiter leaned in politely, lips tight, his voice just above a whisper. I'm sorry, sir, your card was declined. Do you have another form of payment? Brian blinked. That's not possible. Cheryl froze mid-laugh, champagne flute halfway to her lips. Her smile faltered as she caught the waiter's face, apologetic but firm. Brian fumbled for his wallet, muttering as he sifted through 3 other cards. One by one, he handed them over. Each time, the waiter returned with the same look and an increasingly awkward bow of his head. I can step aside with you, sir, he offered, lowering his voice even further. No, Brian snapped. Run it again. At the far end of the table, their dinner guests exchanged glances. One of the women, elegant in pearls, tilted her head toward Cheryl. Everything all right? Cheryl forced a breathy laugh. You know, Banks always trying to protect us from ourselves. But the blush spreading across her collarbone betrayed the strain. Maybe the system's just down, someone offered, half-hearted. Brian finally shoved 2 20s onto the table, barely enough to cover the bottle of wine. We'll take dessert to go, he muttered, rising so abruptly that his chair nearly toppled. Cheryl's heels clicked sharply across the floor as she followed. The air outside was humid, heavy with cut grass and car exhaust. She barely let him open the door of the BMW before rounding on him. What is going on? I don't know, Brian growled, tugging his phone from his pocket and refreshing his banking app. Everything's locked. You said it was under control, she hissed. You said she couldn't touch us. I thought she wouldn't fight back. Cheryl laughed once, sharp bitter. You thought wrong. Back at home, Margaret sipped her lemon ginger tea slowly, the cup warming both hands. The ticking of the vintage wall clock in the corner was steady and comforting, her late husband's favorite sound. Outside, the sun had dipped below the treetops, casting the room in golden hues and long shadows. Evelyn sat across from her, thumbing through a copy of the News and Observer, not reading, just present. Margaret's phone buzzed once. She picked it up. A short message from Thomas, all liens secured, assets isolated. They're locked out. She turned the phone toward Evelyn. Evelyn didn't smile, but her eyes glinted. Every tick hurts them. Margaret set the phone down, and heals me. There was no gloating, just quiet satisfaction, something like balance returning to a table that had tilted for far too long. Evelyn folded the newspaper and leaned back. What do you think he'll do next? Margaret reached for her tea again. Try to play victim. Will it work? She blew gently on the steam. Not this time. An hour later, Margaret stood by her kitchen window, rinsing a teacup, when the landline rang, an old number she rarely used anymore. She dried her hands on a dish towel and answered. Mrs. Doyle? A clipped voice asked. This is Melanie from Capital Estates Auction House. Yes? We need to speak with you regarding a flagged item in our upcoming sale. A set of high-end timepieces was recently submitted under a seller ID linked to a Cheryl Doyle. During vetting, we found several matches to watches previously appraised under your late husband's estate. Margaret's hand froze on the edge of the counter. The voice continued. We're required to report all suspicious consignments with disputed provenance. May we confirm whether these items were legally transferred to Cheryl Doyle? Margaret turned slowly, her gaze landing on the empty space where her husband's mahogany watch case once stood. A piece of her grief twisted into something sharper. No, she said, voice steady. They were not. The display case gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, rows of luxury watches arranged with surgical precision, vintage Omegas, gold-strap Rolexes, and 3 rare timepieces Margaret recognized instantly. Her breath caught as she stepped into the showroom at Capital Estates Auction House, the sterile scent of glass polish and cold metal biting at her senses. There they were, her husband's watches, each one a memory, an anniversary, a retirement milestone, a Father's Day after a hard year, and now listed under private seller, Cheryl Doyle. Margaret didn't move closer. She didn't need to. The scar on the band of the 1969 Hamilton, where Walter had caught it on the edge of their first kitchen remodel, was still there. No one could fake that. Thomas stood beside her, lips pressed into a thin line. Evelyn was to her left, eyes scanning the lot list with fire in her gaze. The auction manager, a tall man with ink-stained fingers and a Bluetooth headset still clipped to his collar, approached briskly. We've pulled the watches from the weekend sale. Ma'am, there's already a cease and desist in place. Based on your confirmation and our own flagged appraisal records, this consignment is now being treated as a potential fraud case. Margaret nodded, voice even. She had no right to them. Behind her, someone cursed under their breath. Brian and Cheryl had been called to the auction house under routine seller verification, but now stood stunned in the corner near the reception desk. Cheryl was red-faced, arms crossed, her voice rising just enough to be overheard. I submitted the forms he gave me, she hissed, glaring at Brian. Don't put this on me, he snapped. You were the one who said no one would know the difference. Margaret turned toward them, quiet but composed. You laughed, she said, her voice cutting the room like glass. You laughed while you tried to sell his time. Cheryl spun, face contorted. This is ridiculous. They were just collecting dust. Margaret repeated softly. Brian stepped forward, palms out. Look, maybe we made a mistake, but this doesn't have to go any further. It already has. Thomas interjected. He turned to the auction manager. You'll be submitting everything to the court? Yes. Full documentation. Listings, signatures, intake logs, security footage. Evelyn folded her arms and stepped in, voice cool. She falsified provenance. That's theft, fraud, and contempt. What do you think a judge will say? Cheryl opened her mouth to fire back but hesitated when the auctioneer began speaking into his earpiece, eyes darting to the front desk. Police are on standby for the intake report, he said. We've had situations like this before. It's policy now. Brian's hands dropped to his sides. His face turned waxy. You're blowing this out of proportion. Thomas raised an eyebrow. No, you are. Margaret's fingers brushed the glass of the display case once more. My husband wore that watch on our last trip together. You never asked what it meant to me. You just saw what it could buy. Silence swallowed the room. Then Evelyn leaned in, her voice almost gentle. Now your time's running out. Back at Thomas's office, the papers were already stacked. Photos, statements, intake forms, certified appraisals, everything organized, ready to file with the court. This changes the landscape, he said. The court doesn't just see financial exploitation now. It sees deliberate concealment, stolen property, and coordinated fraud. Margaret didn't look away from the photos. Her eyes were locked on a shot of the 3 watches in the case. It wasn't about their value. It was about what they represented, what they almost got away with. Thomas clicked a final button on his tablet, sealing the filing. The judge has been notified. And? Evelyn asked. He turned the screen. Punitive damages added to trial. Retroactive. 6 figures likely. Margaret took a deep breath, slow and steady. They tried to sell the past. Now the cost would come due. Interest included. The courtroom smelled faintly of floor polish and institutional history, like something too old to be shiny but too proud to decay. Margaret sat in the front row behind Thomas's table, spine straight, hands calmly folded in her lap. Her blouse was crisp, pale lavender, the same color she'd worn to her husband's memorial. Not a coincidence. Across the aisle, Brian sat with his tie askew, chewing the inside of his cheek. Cheryl, in a tailored blazer 2 sizes too tight, kept darting her eyes to the back of the room, as if hoping anyone would come to rescue them. No one would. At the bench, Judge Ramirez flipped through the thick court packet, the corners of the pages whispering like old ghosts. Thomas stood, voice steady, controlled. As detailed in Exhibits B through H, the total estimated financial misconduct committed by Mr. Brian Doyle, with material assistance from Mrs. Cheryl Doyle, includes an unauthorized $200,000 line of credit, misappropriated estate-linked funds, and attempted resale of personal heirlooms with disputed provenance. That does not include the personal, emotional, and legal cost inflicted on Mrs. Margaret Doyle, a widowed senior whose trust and assets were exploited under false pretense. He paused, letting the numbers settle like ash. Given the court's recent approval of punitive damages, we now submit our final valuation. Total damages and penalties calculated at $637,250. Brian's head dropped like it was suddenly too heavy for his neck. Cheryl's jaw went slack, lips parting slightly, her fingers digging into the seat cushion like the bench might split open beneath her. A gasp rippled through the back rows. Lois, seated alone in muted beige, didn't react. She sat like a statue, tight-lipped, blinking furiously, her Cartier watch tucked neatly under her sleeve. Evelyn leaned in from Margaret's side, voice low enough only she could hear. Expensive minutes. Cheap morals. Margaret didn't flinch. Her hands remained folded on her lap, fingers laced calmly. She didn't smile, didn't blink too much, didn't even adjust her posture. That would have looked like satisfaction. This wasn't about satisfaction. It was about truth being weighed publicly, with receipts. Cheryl finally found her voice, barely a whisper, hoarse and cracking. We don't have that. Judge Ramirez looked up slowly. That wasn't the question. Brian stood suddenly, almost knocking his chair back. This is insane. She's trying to ruin us. She's my mother. And you were her son. Thomas replied, cold and controlled. You don't inherit from someone while they're still alive, and you don't steal from the people who raised you and expect applause. Brian turned to Margaret, eyes wide. Tell them you don't want this, that you're just angry. This isn't you. But Margaret finally spoke, her voice low and even. You stopped knowing who I was the moment you started counting my money. Silence. The court reporter's fingers danced over her keyboard. The clock ticked somewhere high on the wall. Cheryl slumped back into her seat, like the air had left her lungs. Mrs. Doyle, Judge Ramirez said, "Do you have anything you'd like to say before I proceed?" Margaret stood. No rustle of papers. No dramatic pause. Just a clear gaze. You treated my memory like inventory. You turned my grief into your ATM. I've buried a husband. I've led a school. I've walked cancer patients through their final hours. I've seen what time really costs. She paused, then added simply, "And now so will you." Judge Ramirez nodded once. Trial is now formally scheduled for the 21st of next month. In the interim, the lien orders will remain in effect. Mr. and Mrs. Doyle, you are prohibited from liquidating or transferring any assets without court approval. Attempted violations will be treated as contempt. Brian sank back into his chair. Cheryl covered her mouth with one hand. Thomas sat, adjusting his glasses. "Every hour adds up," he murmured to Margaret. Margaret exhaled slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "So does every betrayal." From the back of the courtroom, Evelyn's pen tapped once on her notepad. Steady, deliberate, the same rhythm as a ticking clock. Outside the courthouse, clouds rolled in over Raleigh's skyline. The sky dimmed, not quite storming, just a slow shift, a warning. And inside, the wheels of justice turned, loud enough for everyone to hear. The courtroom was already full by the time Margaret stepped through the double doors. No one rose, no one clapped, just the hollow murmur of anticipation, the scratch of pens against notepads, the low hum of a gallery holding its breath. Every seat was filled. Neighbors, reporters, former colleagues, faces she hadn't seen in years. People remembered when dignity was violated. They came to see it answered. She walked in with Thomas at her side, Evelyn just behind, her cane clicking steadily against the polished floor. Brian was already seated at the defense table, hair slicked back too tight, jaw twitching with barely masked panic. Cheryl, next to him, wore a white suit and a necklace that sparkled under the lights. She looked like she was attending a fundraiser, not a reckoning. Judge Ramirez adjusted her glasses and gavelled the room to order. "This court is now in session." Thomas stood without fanfare. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice calm but resonant, "this is not just a story about fraud. This is about a stolen legacy, about a son and his wife who didn't just take money. They mocked memory. They converted trust into currency and tried to auction off a life they didn't live." Cheryl crossed her arms. Brian stared down at his hands. Thomas turned toward the jury. They didn't wait for loss. They counted the hours until they could profit from it. And when the mother who gave them everything refused to quietly disappear, they didn't apologize. They retaliated. He nodded once. "Now it's your time to respond." He returned to his seat, not looking at the defendants once. The prosecution called Margaret as the first witness. She took the stand slowly, not for drama, but for precision. Her voice was even, her words chosen. She didn't cry, she didn't scold, she told the truth, brick by brick, memory by memory. "The Cartier watch didn't hurt me," she said. "The clock didn't either. What broke something in me was knowing that my son had already signed my life away, that while I was alive, while I was still cooking, reading, laughing, he was forging my name like I'd already passed." The courtroom was silent, heavy. Thomas approached for follow-up. "Mrs. Doyle, when did you realize your assets had been leveraged without your knowledge?" "When the lawyer told me," she said, "and even then it didn't feel real, until I saw the receipt for $4.99. He paused. "Why that moment?" "Because that was when I realized they didn't just steal from me financially," she replied. They saw me as worthless. Even their performance of affection had a clearance tag. A ripple of discomfort moved through the gallery. Brian was next. He was sweating before he reached the stand. His voice cracked halfway through his second answer. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he muttered. I thought it would help us. I mean, Mom didn't need. You mean she didn't need her own retirement? Thomas cut in. She didn't need her name unsullied? Brian's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Cheryl, and that was his second mistake. The first had been trusting her. When Cheryl was called, she entered the stand like a queen summoned, but by the fifth question, the cracks showed. Photos from the auction surfaced. Screenshots of texts, voicemails to the auction house. Every breadcrumb she thought she'd deleted had been retrieved. Brian didn't know the details. Thomas said, You filed the consignment, forged the item histories, and listed estate watches as gifted goods. You presented yourself as the widow's daughter, not daughter-in-law. Explain that. Cheryl's face twisted. She was old. They were just watches. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A juror shook his head in disbelief. Margaret didn't look at Cheryl. She didn't have to. That sentence would do the work. The judge lifted a hand. Given the material evidence and sworn testimony, this court acknowledges grounds to pursue full disinheritance of both defendants, pending final ruling. Brian slumped, shoulders collapsing. Cheryl finally looked stunned, not by the law, but by the realization that she'd never been untouchable. The jury looked on, their expressions no longer neutral. They weren't listening for arguments anymore. They were waiting for punishment. The pen didn't tremble when Margaret picked it up. Her signature was as steady as her stare, every stroke of ink a severing. She sat in Thomas's private conference room, far from the noise of courtrooms and reporters. Outside, the Raleigh skyline blurred beneath streaks of rain, each drop against the window like the tick of a clock counting down. You understand, Thomas said softly. Once this is signed and notarized, there's no default reinstatement, no fallback inheritance, no rights of contest. I understand, she replied. I want it clean. The papers lay open before her, no longer marked by the name of a son who'd traded blood for bank statements, who'd turned legacy into leverage. Now each line carried new purpose. Donations to Wake County Teacher Enrichment Fund, a scholarship for first-generation students at UNC, a bequest to the Raleigh Historical Society for clock and timepiece preservation. And one other name, bold, unflinching. Evelyn Chase. Executor and beneficiary, Thomas said, nodding toward the section. She'll oversee the disbursements personally. Evelyn sat across from her, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose, her mouth pressed tight to hide emotion. You cropped them out. Margaret looked up, meeting her gaze. Exactly. She reached the final page. A blank line waited at the bottom, its emptiness echoing decades of trust that had gone unrepaid. Margaret signed. Slowly. Clearly. No hesitation. Thomas nodded toward the paralegal. Witness, please. The paralegal stepped forward, offered her own signature, and slid the file into a thick blue folder. Once it's notarized and filed, Thomas said, it becomes the controlling document. The estate, your home, your accounts, your collectibles, will go where you said, not where they expected. Margaret leaned back, exhaling through her nose. Let them choke on expectation. Evelyn chuckled, sharp and low. They'll learn. Thomas placed the folder into a locked briefcase and clicked it shut. I'll file the certified copy by morning. They won't see it coming. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. It didn't break, just growled, like a warning more than a storm. Margaret stood slowly, easing her scarf around her shoulders. They thought I'd let it go. And instead, Evelyn said, rising beside her, you locked the door behind them. They exited the office into the lobby, just as a courier passed by holding another thick legal envelope, speaking quietly with a staffer about filing updates. Did you hear? The courier said. She rewrote the whole thing. Left them with nothing. Margaret paused, just briefly, as the words floated behind them, unseen behind a column near the elevators. A figure turned. Brian. He had come unannounced, hoping to plead his case, to find some last-minute crack in the system he'd once rigged to benefit himself. But now he stood frozen, the truth striking harder than any verdict could. Nothing. Not even a footnote in her legacy. He didn't speak, didn't reveal himself. Just stood there breathing through clenched teeth as the elevator dinged open behind him. And Margaret, she never looked back. The knock came at 8:03 a.m. Sharp. Margaret didn't flinch at the sound. She'd been up since 6, sipping strong black coffee from her favorite ceramic mug, the one with the faint hairline crack along the handle. The air in her home was cool and still, humming faintly with the rhythm of her antique regulator clock, ticking away like it had nothing to prove. She opened the door slowly, already knowing. And one other name, bold, unflinching. Evelyn Chase, executor and beneficiary. Thomas said, nodding toward the section. She'll oversee the disbursements personally. Evelyn sat across from her, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose, her mouth pressed tight to hide emotion. You cropped them out. Margaret looked up, meeting her gaze. Exactly. She reached the final page. A blank line waited at the bottom, its emptiness echoing decades of trust that had gone unrepaid. Margaret signed. Slowly, clearly, no hesitation. Thomas nodded toward the paralegal. Witness, please. The paralegal stepped forward, offered her own signature, and slid the file into a thick blue folder. Once it's notarized and filed, Thomas said, it becomes the controlling document. The estate, your home, your accounts, your collectibles will go where you said, not where they expected. Margaret leaned back, exhaling through her nose. Let them choke on expectation. Evelyn chuckled, sharp and low. They'll learn. Thomas placed the folder into a locked briefcase and clicked it shut. I'll file the certified copy by morning. They won't see it coming. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. It didn't break, just growled, like a warning more than a storm. Margaret stood slowly, easing her scarf around her shoulders. They thought I'd let it go. And instead, Evelyn said, rising beside her, you locked the door behind them. They exited the office into the lobby, just as a courier passed by holding another thick legal envelope, speaking quietly with a staffer about filing updates. Did you hear? The courier said. She rewrote the whole thing, left them with nothing. Margaret paused, just briefly, as the words floated behind them. Unseen behind a column near the elevators, a figure turned. Brian. He had come unannounced, hoping to plead his case, to find some last-minute crack in the system he'd once rigged to benefit himself. But now he stood frozen, the truth striking harder than any verdict could. Nothing, not even a footnote in her legacy. He didn't speak, didn't reveal himself, just stood there, breathing through clenched teeth as the elevator dinged open behind him. And Margaret, she never looked back. The knock came at 8 a.m., sharp. Margaret didn't flinch at the sound. She'd been up since 6, sipping strong black coffee from her favorite ceramic mug, the one with the faint hairline crack along the handle. The air in her home was cool and still, humming faintly with the rhythm of her antique regulator clock, ticking away like it had nothing to prove. She opened the door slowly, already knowing. Brian stood on the front step, shoulders slouched, face thinner than before. He wore a jacket too wrinkled to be new, too expensive to have been his second choice. His tie was crooked, his eyes were bloodshot. Behind him, Cheryl stood with a tissue pressed gently under one eye, just enough to make it glisten, not enough to smudge her concealer. Mom! Brian's voice cracked like old vinyl. Can we come in? No, Margaret said, without a hint of cruelty, just truth. Cheryl stepped forward anyway. We just need a minute. Please. She gave a practiced little shudder. We didn't know what we were doing. We thought you'd be okay. Margaret stared at her. You thought I'd be dead. Cheryl blinked rapidly. No, that's not. Brian didn't. He just thought it would all be temporary. That we'd be able to pay it back eventually. You mean after I was buried? Margaret said. Her voice wasn't raised. That made it worse. Brian stepped between them, palms out. Please, don't do this. We lost everything. Margaret tilted her head. You lost what didn't belong to you. There's a difference. His throat bobbed. I made a mistake. You made plans, she corrected. Behind my back. With my name. With her fingerprints. She glanced at Cheryl, who had the nerve to sniff. Your laughter, Margaret said quietly, wrote my answer. For the first time Brian didn't speak. He just stood there trembling slightly, as if his knees didn't trust him anymore. The screen door creaked open behind Margaret. Evelyn stepped out, coat already buttoned, her expression harder than iron. Clock's ticking. Counselor, she said with a glance toward the driveway. Thomas's car pulled up just then, timing perfect as always. He stepped out with a leather case under one arm and a thin file in the other. There's no reversal, Thomas said firmly. The revised will is notarized, filed and backed by 2 legal witnesses. The court won't revisit it without cause, and you've given none. But we're family, Brian said, desperation climbing into his voice. Thomas didn't even blink. You should have remembered that when you signed her name. Brian's lips parted, but whatever came next caught in his throat. Cheryl reached for Margaret's hand. Please, don't ruin us. Margaret pulled her hand back, slowly but with finality. I didn't ruin you, she said. I just stopped funding the fantasy. The clock inside struck the quarter hour, the soft chime echoing behind her like punctuation. She didn't slam the door. She didn't even close it completely, just stepped back and let it fall shut with a soft click. That sound was worse than anything loud. It was silence made absolute. Hours later, back at the courthouse, Judge Ramirez sat poised, pen hovering, all claims confirmed, all fraud substantiated. Motion to finalize restitution, approved. Her signature flowed across the bottom of the order, smooth and permanent. She looked up at the room. Effective immediately. Mr. and Mrs. Doyle are liable for full repayment, including damages, costs and court fees. Collection begins this week. Brian slumped in his seat, face buried in his hands. Cheryl sat stiffly, blinking as if stunned she hadn't charmed her way out. Thomas leaned into Margaret. It's done. But Margaret didn't reply, not yet. Her gaze remained on the judge's hand as it folded the signed order into the court clerk's stack. The paper didn't look heavy, but it carried everything they'd tried to steal, and everything she'd taken back. And the next tick was already waiting. The bailiff's voice rang out over the courtroom like the final toll of a bell. All rise. Margaret stood slowly, calmly adjusting the cuff of her blazer as Judge Ramirez re-entered and took her seat. The tension in the room wasn't loud. It was tight, pressurized. A storm just beneath the surface. Brian's head hung low. Cheryl sat frozen, her arms crossed like armor, her heel bouncing in an uncontrollable rhythm. The room had grown too still for her usual dramatics. Whatever performance she'd prepared had withered hours ago. Judge Ramirez flipped through the thick legal folder, then looked up, her voice clear and unwavering. This court finds sufficient and overwhelming evidence of financial exploitation, fraud, misrepresentation, and attempted liquidation of stolen property. In addition to previously approved restitution, I am ordering full repayment of misappropriated funds, plus court fees, administrative penalties, and punitive damages. She paused for effect. Total amount due $812,906.47. Cheryl made a choked noise in the back of her throat, half cough, half cry. A reporter near the aisle scribbled furiously. Margaret didn't blink. Judge Ramirez continued. This court grants the seizure of all liquid assets belonging to Brian Doyle and Cheryl Doyle, including jointly held accounts, discretionary trusts, and personal property of appraised value over $2,500. Enforcement to begin within 72 hours. Brian's shoulders dropped with an audible exhale. The sound of surrender. It didn't matter anymore if he begged. His breath wasn't worth the oxygen it carried. The judge signed the order with 2 sharp strokes and handed it to the clerk. This court is adjourned. The gavel hit the block. Final. Cold. Done. As the murmurs rose, Cheryl stood and turned toward the gallery, perhaps instinctively looking for sympathy. Instead, a camera flash lit her face just as she reached for her purse. Another reporter caught her full profile as she whispered something sharp to Brian. Her words weren't audible, but her panic was lips trembling, teeth clenched, pupils wild with calculation. Margaret stepped aside as the court emptied, her pace unhurried, her presence unmistakable. A woman no longer underestimated. Evelyn caught up to her at the hallway doors. That felt good, she said, slipping her sunglasses down with one hand and looping her arm through Margaret's. Justice rings on time. Tumas followed behind, legal case in hand, and the last bell's been rung. Case closed. Margaret paused under the old brass courthouse clock. It's ticking slow and steady. No, she said, it's just beginning. For them. They exited into sunlight, the sky wide and open above downtown Raleigh. Spring air touched Margaret's face with something close to relief. Not peace, exactly, but power reclaimed. She didn't smile, not yet, but the weight on her shoulders was gone. She didn't need to gloat. The law had done the speaking. Across the street, a TV news van was parked. A young reporter was already facing a camera, voice animated as the cameraman panned to the courthouse steps. In a ruling that sparked statewide attention, Wake County Superior Court today finalized a sweeping financial judgment against Brian Doyle and his wife Cheryl Doyle, after a series of allegations involving inheritance fraud, forged documents, and attempted auction of family heirlooms. She paused dramatically, tapping her notes, and in a surprise twist, the plaintiff, his own mother, disinherited him entirely. This is the story making headlines tonight. Mother disinherits son after watch scandal. Margaret heard the words echo faintly behind her. She didn't stop walking. The velvet-covered box sat in Margaret's lap like it had always belonged there. Heavy, but not burdensome. Familiar. As the museum curator carefully lifted it from her hands, Margaret exhaled, not in sadness, but with a final measured release. "These belong to your husband?" the curator asked, awed as she opened the box. "Every one of them," Margaret said. Each was a milestone, a memory. He never treated time like it was owed to him. He earned every hour. They stood inside the Raleigh Museum of Horology, its long walnut-paneled halls, lined with clocks from every era, grandfather clocks, ship chronometers, pocket watches in glass domes. There was silence between their ticking, the kind of sacred stillness Margaret had come to crave. She followed as the curator led her to a display case at the heart of the East Wing. Thomas had already coordinated the donation. What began as an act of grief had transformed into something greater, a public reclaiming. The glass case now bore a bronze plaque, etched in simple serif font, "Time remembered, not stolen." The Walter Doyle Collection, donated by Margaret Doyle, with gratitude and intent. Evelyn stood a few paces behind, arms folded, chin lifted. She wore her courtroom heels, despite the polished marble floors, and her satisfaction glimmered without a word. "It's beautiful," she finally said. "It's his again," Margaret murmured, "in the only way that matters." Outside the museum, the wind carried the scent of spring jasmine and fresh mulch from the landscaping crew planting by the sidewalk. As they exited the building, Evelyn held open the door, and Margaret paused on the steps, watching two teenagers wander past and glance at the museum's facade. "They thought they'd inherit," she said softly. "I rewound everything." Evelyn gave a crooked smile, and left them with nothing but the tick. Elsewhere in Raleigh, Brian sat alone on a bench outside the DMV, eyes bleary, hands trembling. His license had just been flagged for garnishment enforcement. His accounts were empty. His car had been repossessed that morning. Cheryl hadn't spoken to him since the final restitution order. 2 days after the ruling, she packed her Louis Vuitton duffel, left her ring on the nightstand, and posted a New Beginnings photo from Charleston. She never looked back. The calls from mutual friends had slowed to a trickle. Is stuff to fulls and mutual friends had slowed to a trickle, not because they didn't hear, but because they had. Margaret's name was back in the community's good graces. Cheryl's, meanwhile, became synonymous with social climbing and stolen jewelry. And Brian, he was whispered about. At first with disbelief, then with disgust. Lois fared no better. Her neighbors stopped inviting her to brunches. One of them returned her spring wreath with a post-it, "Maybe let someone else shine for once." Even the HOA board rescinded her speaking slot at the May luncheon. "We're going in a new direction," they told her. She'd tried to call Margaret once out of some performative idea of reconciliation, but the voicemail box had been full, not by accident. That evening, Margaret stood at her writing desk by the window, light from the setting sun pooling on the hardwood floor like warm molasses. The antique metronome on the corner shelf ticked back and forth with even grace. A fresh leather-bound journal lay open, its first page untouched. She pressed pen to paper. Chapter 1. Time served. She didn't look back as she wrote. Not at the courthouse. Not at the watch. Not even at the woman she used to be. The one who smiled through humiliation because silence seemed safer than war. No more. Evelyn entered the room with 2 glasses of white wine and set one beside her. "You're really doing it?" Margaret nodded. "Not just for me. For anyone who's ever been told they owed their life away." Outside, the first bell from the downtown clock tower rang out, deep and clear. A slow, sonorous note that rolled across rooftops and alleyways like a verdict. Margaret looked out the window, hand still on the page. "His time's up," Evelyn said, raising her glass. Margaret touched her own gently to it, then lifted her eyes to the skyline. "And mine," she said, "is mine again." The applause hit Margaret like sunlight, warm, unrelenting, and almost impossible to look directly into. For a moment she didn't move, just stood at the podium in the center of the museum's new West Gallery, surrounded by glass cases filled with clocks and heirloom watches, all ticking quietly behind her like a chorus of witness. She had never imagined standing here, let alone standing tall. "These pieces," she began, her voice clear and unshaken, "are not just timekeepers, they are keepers of memory. My husband Walter wore each of them through decades of life, birthdays, setbacks, recoveries, triumphs. He never measured success by wealth but by integrity." There was a hush. Cameras didn't click. Even the toddlers fidgeting in the back seemed to stop mid-swing. "I was nearly written out," Margaret continued, "not just from legal papers, but from my own story. But I took it back, because you don't let someone else decide your value." The clapping started before she even stepped away. This time it wasn't out of politeness. It rang with something deeper. Respect, solidarity, victory. From the second row, Lily, her granddaughter, stood on tiptoe, grinning wide with a front tooth still half loose. She clapped harder than anyone. "That's my grandma," she whispered to the woman next to her, proud and loud, as if daring someone to disagree. Evelyn reached for Margaret's hand as she stepped down. Her grip was firm, the way it had always been, grounding. "You were supposed to fade," Evelyn said with a wink. "Instead, you left fingerprints on every glass case in here." Margaret smiled faintly. "Funny what happens when you stop being afraid of being loud." Tumas met them at the far edge of the room, beside a grandfather clock whose brass pendulum moved like a slow heartbeat. He gestured toward the dedication plaque beneath it. "They can't touch this legacy now," he said. "It's inked into history." Margaret said nothing, but her eyes followed the gleaming faces behind the glass. Walter's name inscribed beneath each. Not a single mention of Brian or Cheryl anywhere in the program. Erased. No, not erased. Removed. She walked slowly through the exhibit, her heels soft against the museum carpet. The clocks ticked quietly, calmly. No urgency, no regret, just rhythm. At the far end of the gallery, she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder, untitled, sealed. A draft. Her next estate update. She would finalize it next week with Tumas. Ironclad exclusions, layered protections, not just for herself, but for Lily, and for every inch of history that deserved to be remembered honestly. Her hand brushed the folder's edge. A few more signatures, and it would be done. The ticking behind her grew just a bit louder. So did her resolve. The old brass bells of the Raleigh clock tower tolled just as the sun kissed the edge of the skyline, low and golden, stretching shadows across the red brick buildings below. Margaret sat on the overlook bench, a soft breeze teasing strands of gray hair from her bun. She didn't move, didn't blink. She measured peace now, not in minutes or days, but in the stillness between moments. The journal sat closed on her lap, bound in leather and creased at the spine. Time served, embossed on the cover in quiet gold. One chapter remained unwritten. She knew exactly what it would say. Footsteps crunched on gravel behind her. "You always pick the best seats," Evelyn said, dropping down beside her with two steaming paper cups. "Still black and bitter?" Margaret took hers with a smile. "Wouldn't recognize it otherwise." They sat in companionable silence as the city exhaled its end-of-day sigh, commuters drifting toward parked cars, pigeons cooing on the rails, traffic lights blinking slower now, as if the world had nowhere else to be. Evelyn pulled a newspaper from her bag, folded neatly to the features section. "You're in here again," she said. "Local legacy honoree. Front page ink, too." "I've had enough ink for a lifetime," Margaret replied, sipping. From her coat pocket, Margaret's phone buzzed. "Tumas." She answered without hesitation. "Everything's filed," he said, voice steady, crisp. "New trust instruments, educational endowments, full disinheritance finalized and court protected. Ironclad. They'll never see a dime." Margaret looked out over the rooftops, watching the bell tower's hands shift toward the half-hour mark. "Good," she said. "His time is honored. Theirs is gone." Tumas paused. "I have to say, you did more than win. You rewrote the ending." "I didn't write it," she said softly. "I just took the pen back." She hung up. Evelyn reached over and squeezed her wrist gently, a gesture that didn't ask for anything. They sat without speaking, watching the sky stain into deeper shades of peach and slate. A flock of birds scattered into silhouette against the orange glow, their wings flapping like paper fans. Below them, the bells chimed again, less like a warning now, more like a farewell. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the echo settle in her chest. There was no rage left, no grief, just memory, and something far rarer, peace earned, not handed over. She breathed it in. "Do you regret any of it?" Evelyn asked. Margaret shook her head slowly. "He made his choices. I made mine." They both looked toward the city again. No more words needed. The light faded. The clock tower stood tall, unwavering, and with a quiet strength, Margaret whispered the final sentence aloud. Not bitterly, not boastfully, just as truth. "On Mother's Day my son gave his mother-in-law a diamond watch and gave me a dollar store clock, so I made his time run out."